And with that, let me introduce Mr. O'Toole. I've known Jim for some time. When he taught at UMass Boston, I always wondered why he didn't teach at Boston College, and so the day he turned up here, I wasn't surprised at all. He is a trained historian and archivist and a librarian with graduate degrees from Simmons College in library science and also a doctorate from Boston College. He writes primarily about the history of the Irish in Boston. And he wrote an excellent book, which we were fortunate to excerpt or serialize in Boston College Magazine, called, Militant and Triumphant, William Henry O'Connell and the Catholic Church in Boston. He is currently writing a social history of confession. And the initial salvo in that history appeared in Boston College Magazine as a cover story, I'm pleased to say. And for those of you who would like to see it, it is entitled Hear No Evil, and it's available on the web at bc.edu/bcm, and it's in the fall 2000 issue. So those of you who are interested in an account of the decline of confession may want to read that. This evening, Jim is here to talk about his book called Passing for White, Race, Religion, and the Healy Family, 1820 to 1920. America is known for its love of passing, from creatures like Gatsby to, I guess, Teddy Roosevelt, and all the way up to Ralph Lauren, people who decide to claim other identities and hold fast to them. One of the most peculiar kinds of passing that has taken place in our country is the passage between races, particularly people who are African American, socially, culturally, and who pass for white for all the reasons one can understand. I am pleased to ask Jim to come forward and talk to us about his book. He will discuss the book, do a little reading from it, and we'll have a question and answer session if that's the desire of the folks here this evening. Since this is being recorded and there's only one microphone, I'm going to ask Jim, and perhaps need to remind him, to repeat any questions into the microphone before he answers them. Jim O'Toole, please.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks, Ben, and thank you all for coming tonight. These are not the new basketball warm-up uniforms that I have on, but I realize there's competition. What I'd like to do is begin by asking you to use your imaginations. Imagine that you are a late 19th century Bostonian. Say, put yourself back in the year 1875, give or take. And you're walking down the street, and as you go along, the following people come past you on the street. Which of them would you say is a black man? Get this warmed up here. Is he black? What about him? Is he? And lastly, is he? I suspect you may have concluded that the last one is black, the first two are white, and the third may be somewhere in between. You're not sure. In fact, these four men were brothers. In the order you saw them: Patrick, Michael, James, and Sherwood Healy. And it's in the range of their complexions that I think you can see what makes them so interesting. The saga of this Healy family spans the entire 19th century in time and the entire North American continent in geography. And it tells the story of a remarkable group of siblings each one apparently more capable and accomplished than the one before. But more importantly, it's what this family tells us, I think, about the nature of race in America. I think they challenge what we think we know about the central dilemma of American history, the matter of race. It's all that makes them worth studying. So what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about the family, to describe some of the circumstances they faced and overcame, how they confronted the problem of identifying themselves in racial terms. And this was critical because the society they lived in insisted that everybody was something when it came to race. Everybody had an innate biological racial essence, assigned at birth, carried literally in the blood, unchangeable, an essence from which certain consequences inevitably flowed. If you were white, you were presumed to have capabilities that justified your privileges and dominance in society. If you were black, you were presumed to have inescapable limitations, dozens of things you weren't allowed to do because they were thought to be literally beyond your capacity. Better that you know your place and stick to it. If you were of mixed racial background, you had to be assigned in 19th century America to the lower caste, lest you undermine the very understandings on which American racial privilege and disadvantage were based, according to what came to be called the one-drop rule. Even a single drop of ancestral African blood defined you as an African American. The Healys, I think, are worth studying precisely because they challenge all of those rules and subvert the simple distinction between black and white at the very time when American racial codes were hardening. They managed to escape disadvantage, discrimination, and even worse. And as such, I think they may have something enduring to say to us. Let me tell you a little bit about the family story, which is given in more detail in the pages of the book. The story begins in America with the immigration in 1815 from Ireland of Michael Morris Healy, originally from County Galway. He moves to Georgia, which is very much on the frontier in 1815, very unsettled, and he eventually acquires 1,500 acres of land just across the river from the rising market town of Macon. If you've been to Georgia or can picture Georgia as a kind of a rectangle, Macon is almost dead square in the middle of it. This is cotton country. This is the land that Margaret Mitchell wrote about in Gone with the Wind. Michael Healy is tremendously successful at cotton farming. I've tallied up all the landowners in the county. There were about 500 of them, and in his holdings, the extent of his holdings, he ranks at about number 35. So he's very much at the top of the economic heap. Like other cotton farmers, he also acquired slaves to work the land, and he eventually owned 49 slaves at a time when the average owner in the county owned only 14. One of his slaves was a woman, Eliza Clark, who in 1829 became his common-law wife. Now, it was illegal under the laws of Georgia, and indeed of most other states at the time, for blacks and whites to marry. So Michael and Eliza Healy were never formally married, either by a civil or church authority. It was also illegal for Michael Healy to free his wife, either while he lived or by his will. Freeing of slaves could be done at the time only by special act of the state legislature, and as you might imagine, it was almost never done. So in spite of those obstacles, these two people lived together faithfully for more than 20 years, neither one of them ever marrying anyone else. That alone, I think, qualifies this as a genuine marriage, no matter what the law said. But it had its problems, its dilemmas, including this one. Throughout the South, the children of free white planters and their black slave mistresses or wives, the children were considered slaves, children always took the condition of their mother, usually the slave, not their father, the free master. So the Healy children were, technically under the laws of Georgia, always considered slaves, and their father couldn't free them any more than he could free his wife. The Healy children were never treated as such, but their technical status as slaves meant that it was necessary for them to leave Georgia, which they did one after another as they approached school age. And oh, what children they were, what accomplishments they had in life. Here they are in the order of their birth. James becomes a Catholic priest in Boston, and from 1875 to 1900 is the second bishop of Portland, Maine. Hugh is setting himself up in the hardware business in New York City in the 1850s when he's killed in a freak boating accident at the age of 21. Patrick becomes a Jesuit, and from 1873 to 1882, he is the president of Georgetown University. Sherwood also becomes a priest and serves as the rector of the Cathedral of the Holy Cross in Boston, probably destined, like his older brother James, for a career as a bishop, but he dies at age 39. Martha, the oldest girl, is briefly a member of an order of religious sisters in Montreal before she left the convent, married, and lived in suburban respectability outside Boston. Michael becomes a captain in the revenue cutter service, the precursor of the modern-day Coast Guard, and he enforced law and order off the coast of Alaska in the 1880s and 90s. Josephine becomes a nun in a Canadian nursing order. She too dies young. Her sister Eliza becomes a nun in a Canadian teaching order, and she serves as the superior of several convents in the United States and Canada, including 15 years at a school in St. Albans, Vermont. And finally, Eugene, only the youngest child, seems to fail. Eugene drifts from job to job. He never quite finds himself, occasionally makes his living as a gambler, occasionally lands in jail. I don't know very much about Eugene, but in a family of overachievers, otherwise, I wish I knew more about him and have always felt a certain sympathy for him, simply overshadowed by his brothers and sisters. So I think you'll agree this is really quite a remarkable group. But because these children all had that telltale one drop, they should all have been considered black, according to the rules that governed race in America at the time. So the question that I had to address in studying the family was how, in a society that considered black or mixed race people such as they were, thought these people fit only for the most menial of jobs, how were any of these spectacular achievements possible? How could a black man be a bishop of an overwhelmingly white church in the 1870s and 80s? Or the pastor of a working-class parish largely made up of Irish immigrants, such as the Cathedral parish was at the time? Or the president of an all-white university in a city that was eagerly segregating itself after the Civil War? Or the principal of schools in Ontario and Vermont, or the captain of a government ship? How could any of that happen? That was the question that I wanted to answer. At the beginning, chance played a role. In the middle 1840s, their father happened to run into the Catholic Bishop of Boston on a steamship traveling between Washington and New York. And the bishop suggested that Michael Morris Healy enroll his older sons in the newly opened Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. Papa Healy jumped at the chance. Because their mother was and always would be legally a slave, they were always slaves too under Georgia law, and thus he had to get them out of the South. Once at Holy Cross, run of course by the Jesuits, they were all baptized into the Catholic Church, and most of them made lives for themselves in that church as priests or nuns. In doing that, I think they were able, in a sense, to triangulate, to use a current term, triangulate around the problem of racial identity. They became white, in effect, by first becoming Catholics. They weren't storming the color line head-on and forcing their way across it. Instead, they were working by indirection, taking up positions in this all-white church, one that was itself somewhat separate from the rest of American society, a little world of its own. That permitted an easier transit across the color line. Young Mike Healy did essentially the same thing, I think, but his triangulating institution was not the church, but rather the revenue cutter service, another little world of its own. Now, the reasons not to be black in the 19th century in America were, of course, legion. So we can understand, I think, their desire to live in the white world, even if today that seems a kind of betrayal of part of who they were. But the more difficult question is why white Americans, including those who knew the family's background and its racial secret, if I can put it that way, why white America let them get away with it. In the America in the half-century after the Civil War, racial dividing lines, we know, were solidifying. The barriers against African Americans were being raised ever higher, and the boundaries between the races patrolled with increasing vigilance and, we know, violence. So why were the Healys able to cross those lines and to do all these things that were supposed to be impossible for them? Let me say a word about each one. Sherwood here, I think, is the most interesting case, because he's the one who most looks black, if we can put it that way. A friend of mine suggested, I hadn't seen it myself, but a friend of mine suggested that he looks kind of like a young O.J., right? We won't get him to play the part in the movie. I think, though, when Sherwood walked down the street, passers-by would certainly say to themselves, that's a black man. But that very fact, which should have counted for everything, seems to have counted for nothing. After a succession of early assignments, he became the rector of the Cathedral in Boston, and in the early 1870s, he supervised the fundraising for and the construction of the new cathedral building, the present cathedral building on Washington Street in the South End. Thousands of ordinary parishioners, most of them working-class Irish immigrants, accepted him as their spiritual leader, and no one ever said a word about his background or his race. In all the newspaper reports and other documents that I've found relating to him, he is referred to simply as Father Healy, as if he were just another priest with an Irish name. His parishioners went to confession to him and told him the most intimate details of their lives. They attended his masses and took communion from his hands. On a practical level, they gave him their money to spend on projects that he had determined. Workmen took orders from him as they almost certainly would not have done from someone else who looked the way he did. He was, in effect, hiding in plain sight. His status as a priest in a white church was crucial. He never identified with the local black community in Boston, but rather identified solely with the white community, and thus he became a part of it, regardless of what he looked like. His brother James was even more successful in the church, rising to the rank of bishop. And here he is dressed as a bishop. This is 1875. Here he is as a younger man, about 20 years earlier. His features were somewhat less pronounced than Sherwood's, but he was generally known to have some African-American heritage. But he, too, carefully distanced himself from that heritage within the church and otherwise. During Reconstruction, for example, he expressed skepticism in his diary over what he called the super-elevation of the Negro. For him, the Negro was obviously someone else. The test case in his life, I think, came in the form of another priest of the time named Augustus Tolton, a former slave who had been ordained in Europe and did missionary work among African-American Catholics in Illinois. Tolton regularly in the 1880s and 90s conducted fundraising tours around the country, including here in New England. And everywhere he went, newspapers described Tolton as the only colored Catholic priest in America. To say that Tolton was the only black Catholic priest was to say that James Healy was not black, even though the one-drop rule was supposed to insist that he was. Thus, Healy escaped the indignities that blacks usually encountered. During his 25 years as a bishop, he traveled to California and back 4 times, and never once did he have to ride in the Jim Crow railroad car. The Jesuits knew all about Patrick Healy and his background, but it never stood in his way, though it was not widely known outside the Jesuit order. After studies and ordination in Europe, Patrick was assigned to Georgetown in 1866, and his advancement there over the next decade, first as dean, then as president, was remarkable both for its speed and its ease. Think of it. Here's a school in Washington, D.C., less than a decade after the end of the Civil War, still enrolling a largely Southern student body, and the president was a man who, no matter what he looked like, was a black man by definition. If word of that got out, I think, the place was finished. But Patrick was not just president, he was an active and visible president. He reformed the curriculum, he reined in the previously independent law and medical schools, he rebuilt the campus. The principal building on the Georgetown campus, comparable to our Gasson, is known as Healy Hall. And he undertook a cross-country fundraising tour to make all of that possible. The best evidence I found of Patrick Healy and how he was viewed on campus was a quote from a student who had had Patrick Healy in class and described him as the clearest thinker and the best teacher I ever had. The student in question was a young man from Florida named Stephen Mallory, whose father had just happened to be the Confederate Secretary of the Navy. That student would never have said that about Patrick Healy if he had known the story. Patrick might occasionally encounter some difficulties within the order. An old Jesuit told me once that there were some Jesuit houses around the country that wouldn't receive Patrick Healy when he traveled, on the grounds that no one else would ever be willing afterwards to sleep in the bed that he had used. But in public, Patrick Healy could take advantage of his appearance to cross the color line successfully. Now, what about the women of the family? Sadly, there are no photographs of them, so we can't know what they looked like. After 10 years of working on this project, I got close, I thought, a couple of times, but I was never able to find photographs of the sisters. I'd give at least my left arm to find them. I have to assume, though, that their complexions were light, and in any case, for 2 of them, religious habits obscured most of their faces. Martha, the oldest girl, married a white Irish immigrant store clerk and settled down in Newton, Massachusetts, making an easy transition into the white community. Her death certificate identified her as white, and that was the identity carried on by her children and grandchildren, and it's descendants of that line in the family that I've been in touch with. The family name is Riley today. Josephine, the middle sister, had a very short life as a nun in a nursing order, as I've said, but her sister Eliza, who became Sister St. Mary Magdalene of the Notre Dame order, had a longer and more interesting life. She embodied, I think, all the paradoxes of being a Catholic nun. On the one hand, she was apparently removed from the world in the highly confined space of the convent. But on the other hand, she used her status as a sister to get an advanced education and to have a professional career that would have been almost impossible otherwise. She was the superior, as I've said, of several convents and schools, managing personnel, budgets, physical plant, students, curriculum, including her time at St. Albans. She also helped to plan and open a college for her order on Staten Island. She was, I think, in the end, comparable in achievement and public career to her brothers in a way that was unusual for any woman of her era, let alone a nun, let alone a woman of mixed racial background. This brings us to young Michael Healy, whose origins were unknown within the revenue cutter service. By the way, there's his wife, daughter of Irish immigrants, and their son. I'll go back to him. Nothing was said about his racial background when he enlisted in the revenue cutter service or when, at the end of the Civil War, he received his officer's commission. It had to be that way. We know that African Americans had long found opportunities on the sea that they didn't have on dry land, but there was a ceiling above which they couldn't rise. When he was made a captain in 1883, knowledge of his heritage would surely have blocked that promotion. But instead, his background remained secret, and he went on to have a picturesque and distinguished career in Alaska, enforcing the laws, trying to keep the trafficking in liquor and guns, especially out of native hands, working to stop the poaching of seals and the killing off of the seal population. He was also involved in a very interesting project to introduce reindeer into Alaska. When he was up there, he would periodically sail back and forth between Alaska and Siberia, and he noticed that the natives on the Siberian side were more prosperous than those on the Alaskan side because the Siberians had domesticated reindeer and used them for food and travel and clothing and so on. And so he hatched this scheme to import reindeer from Siberia to Alaska, and every summer he'd make about a dozen trips back and forth buying reindeer from the Siberian natives, kind of winching them aboard the cutter, sailing them to Alaska, and then offloading them. It was really quite a feat, and as he was doing it, essentially converting the cutter into a floating barn. I wouldn't have liked to be a crewman at the time. But he did all of those things and became easily the most famous person in Alaska. The real test for him, however, came in the 1890s, when he was tried a couple of times in court-martial for abuse of his men, once convicted, once acquitted. And in the testimony of one of those trials, the key moment, I think, came when an insubordinate seaman, denouncing the captain, said he was nothing but a goddamned Irishman. Surely that man would have called him something worse, if only he knew that he might. So the achievements of the Healys, individually and collectively, I think are remarkable in themselves, but even more so for the times that they lived in. And it's at this point that I'd like to read a part of the conclusion of the book that I think sets them in their times and presents the dilemmas that they faced. Above all, of course, it was the matter of race that always remained problematic. Even more decisive than the color of their skin, which, as we've seen, varied considerably from one to another, was the meaning assigned to their blood. They had the fateful one drop that was all their society needed to identify their inner essence and to assign them to a fixed, inferior place. Biology was supposed to be destiny for them. Their blood defined them as African Americans. White opinion about such people was nearly unanimous. The United States Supreme Court had put the matter succinctly in its Dred Scott decision of 1857, a year when the Healy siblings ranged in age from 8 to 27. Blacks possessed no rights which a white man was bound to respect, the court said. Civil War had nullified that judgment, but the underlying assumptions remained in place. Once slaves, the Healys were now simply former slaves, entitled to legal personhood perhaps, but certainly not to equality. After hopeful experiments in the 1860s and 70s, their society intensified its means for sustaining their liabilities. The worst of these occurred in the South, where the vote was systematically restricted and violent methods of control became commonplace. Lynching, for example, occurred at the rate of 2 or 3 per week between 1890 and 1970, one historian estimates. The North was more subtle, but no less effective in blocking freedom's promise. Even Boston, home to the Healys, had firm, if largely unwritten, rules governing black life. Like most of us, the Healys came to see their lives as normal, but doing so required that they ignore much of what was happening around them. James, for example, became the Bishop of Portland in 1875. The next year, the Supreme Court declared that voting was not a necessary attribute of citizenship, paving the way for widespread black disfranchisement. A year after that, federal troops began to withdraw from the South, and attention to the civil rights laws came to an end. Patrick went across the country and back raising money for Georgetown in 1878. 3 years later, Tennessee passed a new law segregating railroad cars that became the model for Jim Crow statutes elsewhere. Eliza became the superior of a convent for the first time in 1895. A year before, Congress had repealed the Enforcement Act, thereby giving a freer hand to the revitalized Ku Klux Klan. Captain Michael Healy reached the pinnacle of his career in 1896. That spring, while he was awaiting the verdict in his own trial, another verdict came in. The Supreme Court decided the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, making separate but equal the law of the land. In such a context, the lives of the Healys must be understood as anything but ordinary. Let me skip a couple of pages. A century and more later, their choice of whiteness over blackness seems at some deep emotional level wrong. Passing remains for us a controversial word and a suspect idea, though for different reasons than in their day. Then it implied deception, mocking society's rules by concealing one's allegedly true identity. Today, it suggests a lack of pride, a willingness to feel shame about oneself when no shame is warranted. It seems wrong, too, that we should claim blackness for them when they did not, to praise them as the first black bishop or president or captain or religious superior when they wanted no such honor. But to ask this family to fulfill the expectations of a society very different from their own is anachronistic. Faced with their dilemmas and their times, can we say that we would have done things differently, that we would have been bolder? Faced with the powerful forces of oppression that were all around them, would we too not have taken advantage of whatever escape fortune provided? From the complicated moral terrain of their lives, the Healys speak to an America still struggling with the same quandaries. When W.E.B. Du Bois predicted in 1900 that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line, he was surely prophetic. But we know now that more than a single century will be needed to resolve that problem. As we try, we should note that the Healys' experience is becoming more common. Sociologists tell us that ours is a time when ethnic lines are increasingly unclear. By the year 2050, more or less, the statisticians predict, the United States will be a nation in which no one race, as that term has traditionally been defined, will constitute a majority of the population. The rate of intermarriage, not limited to that across the lines of black and white, continues to increase. Unusual then, the Healys now seem the forerunners of a reality becoming ever more real. Perhaps then the lesson they offer is in how individuals can take into their own hands the question of who they are. They refuse to conform to society's preconceptions, and with the help of many allies, they manage to escape and to get on with their lives on their own terms. In that, the Healys have much to teach us. Thanks. take questions, which I will repeat when they... Ernie, sure.
It seems like there are obvious advantages to becoming a nun or a priest in that you won't face the problem of having children. But I wonder if, since you studied the Catholic Church and its history so much too, if there aren't some cultural dimensions to the Catholic Church that also make it easier for them to hide their race.
Yeah. Okay. The question is that there are advantages to their becoming priests and nuns in not having to face the prospect of children, and that is the case for most of them, although some of them do have children. But were there other advantages, other things about the Catholic Church that made that a likely home for them? Have I stated the question about right? I think it was a very complicated matter. On its face, becoming Catholics when they did in the 1840s and 50s doesn't look like much of an advantage, especially around here. This is just as Catholic immigration to Boston and New England is beginning in earnest, and it faces a tremendous amount of nativist opposition. They become Catholics in the 1840s, just about 10 years after the nativist riot destroyed the Ursuline convent in Charlestown. It seems to me that made the Catholic Church a somewhat unlikely choice for them. I'm anomalous in society because of my race. I know. I'll join this church that everybody hates too. It just doesn't seem like a sensible way to go about it. I think the advantage that the church gave them was that it was, to some degree, removed from the rest of society. It was its own little internal world with its own systems of promotion, advancement, and so on. And so they could be in society, but also removed from it at the same time. I think, too, the fact that it was an overwhelmingly white church meant that they could identify with it. At the same time that the Healy brothers are not suffering for their race, there's evidence of black ministers, of black congregations being subject to those disadvantages. While these people are riding in the white railroad cars, black ministers are being routinely thrown out of the railroad cars because I think they identify with the black community. So they were very definitely distancing themselves and quite deliberately associating with the white community. But even so, given the status of the Catholic Church, I think it wasn't a sure bet going into it. So,
I wonder if the fact that they lived away from the South, where people had probably seen children result of the master-slave relationship, but I wonder if here in the North, where there were fewer opportunities for the average person, black or white, to see the results of racial intermarriage.
yeah. The question is the effect of living in the North, where interracial marriage was uncommon and not recognized or not familiar to the people here. If that had some effect on their being accepted, it may well have. In the South, certainly interracial offspring of masters and their slaves were quite common. But even in that, I think these people were different in that the father didn't marry a white woman and have a real family, a respectable family, but was married only to his slave wife and recognized these children as theirs. Once they moved to the North, that may well have made it more likely that they would be accepted. But it could just as likely have been that it made them stand out as all the more unusual, and therefore people who were sort of violating the racial rules and therefore ought to be singled out precisely because they were doing that.
There was very little intermarriage between the Europeans, but I could see somebody saying, well, my mother was Greek and my mother was Italian, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the question is about other forms of ethnic intermarriage, and that certainly picked up as the century went on. At the time that they're becoming adults, the 1840s and 50s before the Civil War, I think racial and ethnic lines in America are much simpler, much starker in black and white terms. So.
One of the reasons I'd love to know more about Eugene is that it seems that passing is really a tacit agreement that gets filtered through some institution that you're connected to, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a rootless one, and I wonder if he had more trouble in that sense because he wasn't really that institution. But the question I wanted to ask was about sort of the interior culture of the family. I mean, there were lots of them. Did they have a sense of themselves as an extraordinary family? Did they write to each other and have kind of internal narratives? And
Yeah.
That's because, I've been looking at these sort of steely faces, and you've been talking, and I'm
Right.
thinking, what would the table, what would all these people around the table be like?
Yeah, right. The question is about the interior life of the family and the sense of the family as itself. This is a remarkably close family. Despite the steely gazes of 19th century portrait photography, these were people who constantly stayed in touch with one another. They wrote to one another. They looked after one another. They visited one another. They went on vacation together. Several of them were regular diarists throughout their entire life. That's great for a historian. Lots of evidence to find and read through. Most of them had pretty good penmanship as well, so they were easy to read. So this was a very close family, closely knit family, and I think therefore had a real sense of itself as a family. But perhaps revealed by the steely photographs, nowhere in any of this correspondence and diary, for all practical purposes, nowhere do they talk about the elephant that's in the room. And so this great question that we want to know about how they think of themselves in racial terms is generally not there. And whenever it shows up, it's done in language that convinces me that they have all agreed that they are white. The Negro is always someone else. In his school diaries, there's a wonderful diary that James kept during his senior year at Holy Cross. In the pages of that diary, and he was probably about 18 at the time, he uses the N-word a couple of times. That's obviously not something that applies to him. It applies to somebody else. So it's a remarkable family, and I wish they said more about themselves than they do, but there is a lot of evidence for understanding it. The first part of your question about the mediating institutions, I think is a point well taken. These aren't people who are getting across the color line on their own. There is some kind of mediating institution, whether it's the church or the revenue service, and perhaps Eugene, the ne'er-do-well of the family, because he doesn't have one of those, is stuck in that position. So.
Do you have any information about the patriarch's connections in the North? He's a wealthy son.
Mm-hmm.
He can go where he wants and buy what he wants.
Right.
But back in the 1840s, the Cathedral famine, there's a big influx of Irish immigrants coming into New England.
Right.
Some of these immigrants, I think, had to be sponsored. I'm talking about coming from Ireland now, to the United States, had to be sponsored, otherwise thrown over the side, because they were of very little value in the eyes of the
Right.
Yanks and like a dollar good friends from across the river. I wonder if the patriarch and the family had brothers or nephews. I mean, you send an 18-year-old kid to Worcester to go to Holy Cross, and you're from Georgia.
Right.
That's a big distance.
Yeah.
So this kid's on his own in Worcester?
Yeah.
There's nobody around, no support system?
Pretty much that's the case. The question is about the father, Papa Healy's connections in the North and what kind of support system there was for the children. He had some connections in New York, in the North rather. In particular, a friend in New York who I think was a kind of business associate and helped Michael Morris Healy get his cotton crop to market and so on. There's a man in New York City named Manning who is an executor of Papa Healy's estate and is described in other sources as being a kind of second father to the children. Other than that, though, Papa Healy really doesn't have connections in New York. There are no other family members that come to America that I've been able to identify. He had a brother and two sisters, but they all marry and stay in Ireland. So he's really alone here in this country. Has some business acquaintances in New York, and develops a relationship with Bishop John Fitzpatrick in Boston, who he had run into on the steamship that suggested sending the boys to Holy Cross in the first place. And Bishop Fitzpatrick becomes a kind of watchdog for the family as well. The four oldest boys are at Holy Cross, and Bishop Fitzpatrick can kind of keep an eye on them. The Jesuits take them in, the Jesuits at Holy Cross. There's a Jesuit there named George Fenwick who really looks after these, and in fact it's interesting. There's only a handful of references to Healy the father in the children's papers, and when they talk about him, they always refer to him as Father. Father wrote me a letter. Father paid the tuition, and so on. Whenever they talk about this Father George Fenwick, who was one of their teachers at Holy Cross, they always refer to him as Dad. I think the church, the way I read that is the church became their family in the North, to the extent that when Martha, the oldest sister, is first sent north at about age 10, she boards with Bishop Fitzpatrick's sister. And her family. So I think this is another of the appeals, I think, of the institution of the church to them. The church becomes a kind of surrogate family because their own family, especially when these kids are young, is so attenuated and so spread out across the country and so on their own. I think that leads them to look to the church for their careers and their lives. The evidence is very slim for that earlier period, and I wish I knew more about it than I do, but those are the conclusions that I draw from it.
Follow-up question, if I may. How old is the College of the Holy Cross at this time?
The question is how old Holy Cross is at this time. Holy Cross has just opened. It had been open for 1 year before these kids enrolled. James Healy, the oldest, is in the first graduating class of Holy Cross in 1849, and in fact is the first valedictorian at Holy Cross. So this is a brand new institution, by no means assured of success. So in that sense, too, it was something of a risk for the father to commit the family to it. But they were very much a part of it there. Go ahead. Yeah, the question is, how is there a talk of the mother in the correspondence, and what do they say about it? In all the correspondence, I have found a single reference to their mother, and it comes in this diary that James kept when he was a senior at Holy Cross, and he makes an entry one day in which he says, "Father sent a daguerreotype of mother." What I wouldn't give to see that image, long since lost. But what's interesting about the entry is he says that he has this daguerreotype of mother, and then he notes, "And I even recognized her after all this time away from home." These kids had left home when they were about 6, James a little older, maybe about age 8. So the older ones had these very vague recollections of their mother. The younger ones, I think, carried no direct memory of their mother into adulthood. The 3 youngest children were all less than 5 when the mother died in 1850. So for them, mother was someone that they had never known. There's maddeningly little evidence of that. Tom.
Is there any evidence of the relationship between the mother and the father that survived?
The question is about evidence of the relationship between the mother and the father. The only evidence that survives for that really is the father's will. Again, he treated this woman as his wife, but the law certainly was not going to recognize her status as such. So he had to draw his will very carefully. And in the will, he says that the mother and any of the young children left at home in Georgia when he dies will be taken to a free state. He doesn't say that she will be freed, because that was illegal, and the will could maybe be disallowed by the court for saying that. But he says that she will be taken to a free state, and the property sold off, and she'll have an annuity. Also in the will, though, he doesn't refer to Eliza as his wife, but he does talk about my trusty woman Eliza, the mother of my children. So he acknowledges her at least to that extent. Fortunately, she died first. They die within 3 months of each other in 1850. And I say fortunately she died first, because if he had died first, I think it's most likely that she and the 3 young children left at home would simply have been sold as slaves. But she died. There's evidence that he was liquidating the property in Georgia and intending to move to the north himself with the younger children, but he died before that happened. So there is a kind of acknowledgement between him and her of their status. I think they're able to get away with this very unorthodox marriage because in the 1840s, Macon is still basically the middle of nowhere. And their property is way out in the countryside. I think on a week-to-week basis, they didn't encounter many other people. So this relationship was not something that, even though the local community would have known about it, was sort of in their face. And I think that maybe allowed it to be tolerated in a way that it wouldn't have been in a more settled area, perhaps. So. The question is about whether they'd been introduced to the Catholic Church before leaving the South. The answer is no. These were people without a church in Georgia. It's possible that Papa Healy had been baptized in Ireland before he emigrated, but actually at that time it's just as likely that he hadn't been. There is no Catholic Church presence in Georgia. There's a priest that wanders through every couple of years maybe to say Mass. But there's no organized church, and the children aren't baptized until they get to Holy Cross. So their Catholic identity really comes on them as teenagers, and in that sense, perhaps they were converts and therefore had some of the zeal and commitment that converts often have, leading them to choose careers in the church.
Jim, were you able to find descendants of the Healy family or the Riley family? Were they aware of their past?
Yeah. The question is about descendants of the Healy family and what they knew about their past. I was fortunate to find current generations of the Healy family. As I say, the family name is Riley. One of them is a graduate of Boston College in the class of about 1964 and is now an anthropology professor and dean in North Dakota. Who studies native tribes, actually. So he's very interested in this racial identity stuff related to his family. And then I've also I've corresponded and emailed with a descendant of the captain as well. All of these folks now, for generations, long since passed into the white community. It's interesting, when I first met them, I wanted to know how they came to know this family tale. And these are people all about my age, a little older, and so they would have been teenagers and growing up in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And when I first met Tom Riley and his siblings, they each told me a version of the same story about how they came to learn about the family. And they said that when they were about 12 or 13, they remembered it as being around the time of their confirmation. their father took them aside and said, "Now there's something you must know about the family. You must never speak about this in front of your grandmother." Closer to the original generation, who was shocked by the whole business. But here's the story. And their reaction was uniform. They thought, this is great. We're not just some, run-of-the-mill Irish family from Waltham, which is where they lived. We've got this really neat family story. And given the times, the origins of the civil rights movement and so on, they use this to connect themselves to that. So now, what was for a long time the family secret is now something that they're very proud of. It's an interesting change of historical perception, I think.
Well,
So,
thank you, Jim.
thank you all. Thank you.